Well, let's get to inflation. Yesterday's consumer price index from the ABS, Bureau of Statistics, put it at 7.8% in the December quarter. That's a 30-year high. Economists expressed shock. They thought it would come in around 7.5%. The Treasurer in his press conference said it was unacceptably high. Well, what's it all mean for us, though, in granular mortgage detail? Let's bring in News Corp business columnist Terry McCrann to help us understand it all. Terry, great to have you on the show as always. Jim Chalmers was pretty confident yesterday. He says inflation has peaked, although, as I said, it was higher than expected from prognosticators in your business. But there is a concern the RBA is still sending all these signals that they think we need more rate increases. We know they meet 10 or so days' time. Are we going to get more increases? And what's your take on yesterday?
Well, the bottom line, Peter, is that it should be the peak of inflation. We should be able to see inflation fall from this point on. However, it's not something that's just going to happen because we want it to happen, and certainly not something that will happen just because our new Treasurer wants it to happen. This is an absolutely pivotal time that we can choose to have lower inflation or we can choose to allow it to run away. The bottom line, Peter, is that it comes back to us, and the critical thing is what the Reserve Bank does with interest rates, but also as important is what happens with wages. Now, the Reserve Bank will raise interest rates again in 2 weeks, so Tuesday week. The question has always been whether it'll be 25 points or 50 points. I would argue that this is so important that we get on top of inflation right now that they should go 50 points, at which point you can then start to think about rates rises ending. But the other critical element is wages. We cannot allow wages to start chasing those higher inflation numbers, Peter, because if that happens, we're back in a 1980s situation, and the end of that is much, much more punishing interest rates. You know, they'd be talking about rates which would make these rates look very attractive.
Okay, one of the things fueling inflation obviously is spending, and we'll focus in a minute on consumer spending, but there's also government spending. Governments are spending up big, and we saw in the recent state election in Victoria, both sides roundly condemned for their spending profiles. But just on the issue of us, you talk about us and what we can do. When the RBA puts up rates, it impacts only about a third of us, because a third rent, a third already own their homes outright, and a third, me included, have got a mortgage. Now, if you're continually screwing down the mortgage holder by raising up rates and saying, you know, focus on your mortgage and don't spend elsewhere, sure, you'll make life tough for them and you'll reduce their spending. But what about the other two components of the Australian population? They're not impacted by the RBA necessarily.
Well, what's clearly important for renters is the price of property, and therefore what people want to get in rentals. So that if property prices don't keep spiralling, as they had been up until the Reserve Bank started to raise interest rates, that really is the ultimate way of getting some comfort, some easing of the pressure on renters. And for the other third that don't have a mortgage, obviously they've been paying the price because of the other side of the interest rate issue has been zero interest rates for depositors, for savers, and they're now getting, starting to get some sort of a return. But let's not forget about government, Peter. I mean, much of this inflation has been self-imposed. Yes, petrol prices as a function of oil prices, and obviously was prompted by the rises as a consequence of what happened with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But we didn't have to have the price increases in energy. We didn't have to have the price increases in gas. That's all been self-inflicted because of what we're doing to make energy unaffordable. And you know, getting rid of all the cheap, reliable coal-fired power and creating this energy shortage, which has been totally unnecessary. And the same applies to the gas industry. In Victoria, you cannot find gas. You're not allowed to look for gas. You're certainly not allowed to develop it. So is there any wonder that gas prices have gone up when supply has been impacted? So much of this inflation has been self-imposed.
Or just on cue re-government, and I don't let Scott Morrison and the federal government off for the largesse. Certainly the subsequent packages, fair enough, the first one, JobKeeper, but later on, just that quantum of spending that's tipped us up the way of $1 trillion of debt. But in Victoria, the Parliamentary Budget Office, so the independent arbiter of numbers, looked at the post-election review of the state of Victoria's budget, and it is red ink as far as you can see. The economy grew 5.5% as a percentage of state GDP, or the equivalent of, whatever you call it, state profits, but it's now 19.3%. They say it's forecast to reach 24.6% in a couple of years' time, and that's when Victoria's debt's going to be $165 billion. That's 50% higher than any other state in the country, and no plan, Terry, to bring it down.
Absolutely, Peter. I mean, this is, for every Australian is responsible for that $1 trillion, or has a share of the burden of that $1 trillion of federal debt. But in the case of Victoria, you've got to add on to that exactly the numbers that you're talking about. And I would have to say, to me, they are probably going to be on the low side as the reality is actually going to turn out to be much worse. Let's just focus on one thing, Peter, that massive boondoggle of that suburban rail loop, which is supposed to cost $100 billion, is probably almost certainly going to cost $200 billion, all of it funded by debt. So that in terms of the Victorian burden of debt, you've got all the federal debt, plus you'll have the Victorian debt on top of that. So it's not, and the numbers will be worse than they owned up to be at this point in time.
All right, just to be clear, GDP, gross domestic product, that's the national data number, and GSP, gross state product, gross state product. I know them, but I obviously have worked federally and I focus on the bigger number. I might just say to my audience, we didn't coordinate our clothing either, but we've come in almost pitch perfect tonight. Terry McCrann, thank you. Happy Australia Day.